Hello everybody, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Avowed. I've been trawling through many tips and trick videos to pull together for you a definitive list of all the best tips and tricks. But rather than myself going through them all for you, I'm going to hand you over to the very lovely Sky, who is going to go through all the tips and tricks for you. Thank you.
Oh, Silver, you are so creepy. Stop coming on to me. It's never going to happen.
I wasn't coming on to you, I was just saying you had a very lovely voice.
Yeah, right? Loser. Anyway, shut up, my fans want to hear my tips. All right, let's dive into Avowed. I've been through a mountain of YouTube videos to bring you all the best tips and tricks. Time to sift through them all and really hit the ground running. It's not just about listing off tips, though. I want to make sure I understand why they matter, how I can use them to my advantage. So, first up, character creation. It seems like a lot of the advice out there is not to sweat the details. Apparently, your background mostly just changes the dialogue and roleplay, not your actual build. Plus, you can reset your attributes and skills. So why not just try to min-max right from the start? That's a great point, and it really highlights something cool about Avowed's flexibility. This game wants you to try different things, find what feels right. No need to get locked in, you can totally respec and test out different builds. I know it might seem overwhelming at first, but it's actually pretty freeing. It means you can focus on having fun, seeing what clicks. No pressure, right? But there's a lot of talk about the godlike features, those planty things growing on your character's face. Some players love them, others not so much. Well, the devs thought of that. You can actually hide those features if you want. No gameplay changes. So, you can still have a godlike character for the role playing, but maybe skip the mushroom on your forehead. That's a nice touch. It seems like Avowed really wants players to focus on what matters. Their own play style. Speaking of play styles, any recommendations on must-have skills? I'm seeing constant recovery, parry, and survivalist pop up a lot. Why are those so important? Any others worth considering? Those are solid picks no matter what you're going for. Constant recovery is a lifesaver, literally. It gives you steady health regeneration, so you don't have to rely on potions as much. Parry is amazing for offense and defense. You can counterattack and open up enemies for big hits. And Survivalist, especially at rank 2, unlocks some crazy powerful healing foods. Think of it as an investment in long-term survival. Survival is definitely key, especially with Avowed's gear system. One thing that surprised me is that upgrading gear is actually more important than leveling up. That's pretty unique. How does that even work? It's really interesting. Avowed doesn't scale enemies based on your level like most games. Instead, it scales them based on the quality of your gear. So, you have to keep upgrading, especially those unique weapons and armor to stay ahead of the curve. So, it's not about having a ton of gear, but making a few key pieces really strong. Makes sense. But it also sounds like you have to be smart about resources. Definitely. And don't make the mistake of selling all your unwanted gear. Break it down for materials instead. Those materials are what you need to upgrade that special gear. They become even more valuable later on. All right, so smart resource management from the get-go. Got it. Moving on. I'm fascinated by the focus on exploration. It's not just about finding cool stuff. There's verticality, environmental puzzles, even using sound to your advantage. What makes exploration so special? It's all about rewarding players who are curious, who really pay attention. Don't just follow the main path. Engage with the world. Use parkour to reach new areas, solve puzzles, listen carefully for those audio cues that might lead you to hidden treasure. I love that. I even saw people mentioning turning up the sound to hear nearby chests. I'm definitely keeping my ears open for that. Speaking of secrets, what about combat in Avowed? It seems like more than your typical hack and slash. From what I've seen, combat in Avowed is more strategic, more layered. You have to understand enemy weaknesses, utilize companion abilities, and sometimes, maybe even retreat. Wait, retreat? Running away. That sounds counterintuitive. Isn't that just delaying the inevitable? Not always. Sometimes retreating is the smartest play. It might let you regroup, thin out those enemy groups, or get into a better position, especially if you run into a really tough fight. That makes sense. Knowing when to fight and when to run is part of the strategy. Speaking of which, there's a lot of buzz around Kai's taunt ability. How does that fit into combat strategies? Kai's taunt is super valuable, especially when you're starting out. It basically lets you control who he's attacking. That gives you breathing room to do damage, heal up, or reposition for a better attack. So it's like an extra layer of control over the battlefield. What about consumables? I've seen some crazy strong food buffs. Are they worth using in combat? Definitely don't underestimate consumables in Avowed. Food buffs can give you huge advantages: increased damage, damage reduction, health, and essence regeneration. And get this, a lot of them stack so you can combine the effects for maximum impact. Okay, I'm seeing the potential here. This Magrand's blessing everyone keeps talking about 20% damage boost and a 20% damage reduction. That's wild. It's a game changer, especially for those tougher fights. Don't be afraid to experiment. Find food combos that work for your playstyle. Got it. Experimentation is key. But before we move on to the party camp, which seems like a whole other topic in itself, tell me about these unique items. What makes them so special? Unique items are more than just stats. They have their own lore, backstories, and a lot of them have abilities that can totally change how you play. So it's not just about raw power, but also finding items that fit your build and role-playing choices. Love that. Exactly. And that sense of discovery, finding a unique item with its own story and special powers, that's what makes exploring in Avowed so rewarding. It sounds like we've just scratched the surface. But before we get totally lost, let's take a closer look at the heart of the Avowed adventure, the party camp. We'll get into that in part 2. I'm already feeling inspired by how deep and flexible Avowed seems to be. It's all about making the game your own, experimenting, finding what works best for your playstyle. All right, so we've covered character creation, builds, gear, exploration, combat, and now it's time to unpack this party camp. Seems like way more than just a place to rest. It's definitely more than that. The party camp is your hub, your home base throughout the game. Think of it like a command center where you manage your character, craft, upgrade, and even get some unique bonuses. From what I'm seeing, it's practically its own minigame. You can really fine-tune your build and max out your gear, which is super important in Avowed. Let's start with the workbench. Sounds like that's where the real magic happens. The workbench is where you'll spend a lot of time upgrading gear. And remember, that's more important than levels in this game, but it's not just about clicking upgrade. There's also a crafting tab. That's where you'll use all those materials you've been saving from breaking down gear. Okay, crafting. This is where things get interesting. It looks like you can actually modify and enhance your items, not just upgrade them. The crafting tab is where you take your gear to the next level, literally. Boost stats, add unique properties, unlock higher upgrade tiers. And here's a pro tip. You can actually upgrade multiple quality tiers at once if you have the resources. No need to click through each one individually. That's a great time saver, especially when you consider how important upgrading is to keep up with those enemy levels. But skipping all those individual upgrades, does that make it harder to manage resources? You know, especially early on when materials are scarce. It's a balancing act for sure. Early game, focus on upgrading a few key pieces, your main weapons and armor. Later on, when you have better materials, then you can experiment more with crafting and take advantage of those multi-tier upgrades. You have to adapt your strategy as you go. Adapt, adapt. That seems to be a recurring theme in Avowed. I like it. So, upgrading, crafting. What about enchantments? I saw some pretty interesting ones, like adding a healing effect to your weapon when you kill an enemy. Is that common in Avowed? Enchanting is awesome. It lets you personalize your build, make those unique items even more powerful. You can add all sorts of permanent bonuses to your weapons. Elemental damage, special effects like the healing you mentioned. So, it's not just about raw stats. You have to find enchantments that work with your play style. It sounds like you have a lot of freedom to create a character that really fits your vision. But with all this customization, how do you avoid getting overwhelmed with choices? That's where experimentation comes in. The cool thing is you're not locked in. You can always change enchantments later if you find something better. And here's a tip. Pay attention to the unique properties of each weapon before you enchant it. Some weapons have inherent bonuses that might make certain enchantments more effective. So, it's a bit of a puzzle figuring out what works best. Moving on from the workbench, we also have the cauldron, which seems to be all about consumables. Yep, the cauldron is your crafting station for all those food buffs we talked about, plus potions and other concoctions. You find recipes out in the world, gather ingredients while you explore, then brew up some seriously powerful stuff back at camp. We talked about Migrand's blessing, how effective it is in combat, but there are also recipes for temporary attribute boosts that could be super useful for passing those tricky skill checks. It's a great way to give yourself an edge. And while those instant buffs are great, don't forget about consumables that do things like healing or essence regeneration over time. They're way more cost-effective than potions, especially early game. Cost-effective. I'm sensing a pattern here. Avowed rewards strategic thinking, resource management. Okay, so workbench, cauldron. What about those totem fragments everyone's talking about? Ah, the totems. One of the coolest features in the camp, in my opinion. You'll find these fragments while you're exploring. Collect enough of them for a specific totem, then you can activate it at the totem stand in your camp. And here's the best part. Activating a totem gives your character a permanent passive bonus. Whoa, permanent. So we're talking about buffs that are always active. What kind of bonuses are we looking at here? They can be all sorts of things. Stat boosts, cooldown reductions, extra effects for abilities. Lots of variety. Like one totem might give you a ring of fire when you activate your second wind. Another one might give you extra healing when you revive a companion. So, exploring isn't just about finding loot. It's about finding these passive bonuses that can really change how your character plays. It's so cool how all these systems are connected. It really encourages you to explore every corner of the world. Exactly. And speaking of exploration and managing all that loot, we need to talk about the stash. The stash, right? Every good RPG needs a stash for all those extra items. But I always dread going back to town just to clear out my inventory. Such a time sink. But in Avowed, you can actually send items back to your camp stash from anywhere in the world. Seriously, that's amazing. No more backtracking just to manage inventory. It sounds like Avowed really cares about making the gameplay experience smooth and convenient. Oh, and one last thing about the camp. Your companions will sometimes want to chat with you there. You'll know they have something to say when you see a little notification icon by their portrait. Oh, right, I saw that. I just figured it was part of the main story or some side quests. Is there more to it than that? Sometimes it might lead to new quests or reveal more about the story, but there's another reason to pay attention. Sometimes these conversations can unlock permanent buffs for your character or even brand new abilities. It's like Avowed is rewarding you for getting to know your companions, building those relationships. So, even just chatting with your companions at camp can have a real impact on your character. I'm really impressed by how much depth there is to every aspect of this game. It's true. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the party camp. As you can see, it's way more than just a place to rest. It's where you craft, upgrade, strategize, even bond with your companions. I'm a little overwhelmed, but in a good way. There's so much to explore and discover in Avowed. Feels like we've only just scratched the surface. We've got a solid foundation, but there are always more tips and tricks to uncover, especially for those just starting out in Avowed. We'll get into those in the final part of our deep dive. All right, so we've tackled character creation, dug deep into builds and gear, explored the party camp, and even figured out how to make a tactical retreat in combat. What else is there to uncover about Avowed? We've covered a lot, but there are always those hidden gems, those little tips that can really elevate your game. Like, let's talk about exploration versus the main story. It's a classic RPG dilemma, right? Focus on the main quest or wander off the beaten path? I'm definitely a wanderer. I love exploring, but then I also start worrying about falling behind on the main story. Is there a right way to approach this in Avowed? Remember how enemy scaling works in Avowed? It's all about your gear quality, not your level. So, taking the time to explore, do those side quests, gather resources, upgrade your equipment. That's actually super important for making it through the main story. So, side quests and exploration aren't just distractions. They actually help you progress. That takes the pressure off. But what about those little difficulty icons? The skulls I keep seeing on some quests. How do those factor in? Ah, those are a good indicator of how challenging a quest or enemy is going to be based on your gear, of course. 1 or 2 skulls are probably manageable, especially if you're confident in your build and skills. But 3 skulls? You better be prepared for a tough fight. Noted. I'll be watching out for those skulls. The videos also mention some cool ways to interact with the environment. We talked about using Kai's pistol for webs, but it sounds like there's even more to it. Oh yeah, tons of secrets and clever interactions. Always be on the lookout for things like explosive barrels. You can use those to open up new paths, or you might be able to freeze water to create your own path across tricky terrain. Avowed wants you to experiment, think outside the box. It sounds like there are so many layers to this game. Just when I think we've covered it all, something new pops up. Any other exploration tips or tricks that might not be so obvious? Here's one that might surprise you. Buy fresh water from the harbor merchant. Sounds boring, right? But it actually gives you a 25% movement speed buff for a few minutes. Great way to cover more ground and explore faster. Okay, that's a fantastic tip. I love maximizing efficiency, especially in a big, detailed world like the Living Lands. Speaking of efficiency, let's talk a bit more about combat. Any other insights? Here's a small thing that can make a big difference. Aim for enemy weak points, especially with ranged weapons. Headshots usually do the trick. You'll see a huge damage increase. Oh yeah, I saw that in some gameplay footage. Those critical hits were super satisfying. What about using companion abilities strategically? We talked about Kai's taunt, but are there other ways to work with companions in combat? Absolutely. Each companion has unique abilities that can really help you out. Experiment with their skills. See what works well with your own play style. And remember, a well-timed retreat can be just as effective as a powerful attack. Sometimes you have to regroup, thin out those enemies to come out on top. So combat in Avowed is more than just brute force. It's about using everything you have: companions, the environment, consumables, even knowing when to run. Exactly. Strategic thinking and adaptability. That's what Avowed rewards. Oh, and speaking of tools, don't forget about lockpicks. Lockpicks, right? I saw a ton of locked chests and doors. Are they essential? Not absolutely essential, but some of the best loot is hidden behind those locks. So make sure to buy lockpicks whenever you see them at a merchant. Trust me, all right. Lockpicks are going on my shopping list. Any other items I should stock up on? Things that might not seem super important at first, but can be helpful down the line. Keep a good supply of healing and essence regeneration consumables. They're way cheaper than potions, and you can pre-buff before those tough fights. And we can stack those buffs, combine the effects. It all comes back to strategy and preparation. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. Any final words of wisdom for those just starting out on their Avowed adventure? The most important thing is to experiment. Find what works for you. Try different builds, skills, weapon combinations, play styles. Avowed is all about that personalized RPG experience. Embrace it. Make it your own. That's a great note to end on. Avowed sounds like a game that rewards curiosity, creativity, strategic thinking. I can't wait for everyone to experience it for themselves and create their own legends in the Living Land.